We're now live.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Shropshire County Pension Fund. I am Tom Biggins, Chairman of the Pensions Committee. I'm obliged to inform you that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. Members of the public will be able to hear the audio of the meeting and view the papers shown on the screen. This meeting is being held using remote technology, and should any committee members experience technical difficulties during the meeting, they should immediately contact the designated IT officer on the number they have already been supplied with. Everyone is requested to mute their microphones unless asked to speak. Please only use the chat function to indicate the desire to speak. Do not use it for anything else, so that it is clear who is asking to speak and the debate has to be heard by those listening to the audio feed. The chairman will interpret the council's existing standing orders in light of the requirements of remote participation, with advice from the monitoring officer prior to making any ruling. At the start of the meeting, members of the committee will be asked to confirm their presence and any disclosable pecuniary interests they have in any of the items on the agenda. Everyone that speaks during the meeting, including members of the committee and officers, are asked to introduce themselves each time before they speak. This is so those listening know who is speaking. We'll now move on to the roll call and disclosure of pecuniary interests. Members are reminded to disclose any pecuniary interest in any matters to be discussed, which is not included in the register of interests, and leave the meeting by switching off their camera and muting their microphone prior to the matter being discussed. I will now ask the committee officer to read out each member's name and ask them to confirm presence and confirm if they have any interests. Over to you, please, Tim.
Thank you, Chair. I will now read out the list. Councillor Thomas Biggins.
Present and no pecuniary interests.
Councillor Chris Mellings.
Present, no pecuniary interest to declare.
Councillor Brian Williams.
Present and no pecuniary interest to declare.
Councillor Michael Wood.
Present and no pecuniary interest to declare.
Councillor Ray Evans.
Present and no pecuniary interest that I'm aware of.
Jean Smith. I'm not sure Jean's in the meeting yet. Laura Hoskisson.
Present, no pecuniary interest to declare.
And I don't think Byron's in yet either. That concludes the list of members, Chair.
Okay, that concludes the list of members of the committee. I would just at this point in time like to ask, are there any other councillor members present, please?
Chair, yes, Councillor Julian Dean present, and I also have no disclosable pecuniary interests.
Okay, thank you very much and welcome to you, Julian. I will now ask officers, advisors and others expected at the meeting to confirm their presence, please. Laura Mitchie from LGPS Central, yep.
Yes.
Amelia Gaston from LGPS Central.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Valborg Lee from LGPS Central.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Gordon Ross from LGPS Central. Gordon, are you here yet? Not as yet, but okay. Dominic Delaforce from BMO.
Good morning. Yes, present.
Alan Fitzpatrick from BMO. Not yet, I guess.
He is present, but I think maybe he's on mute.
Okay, and Peter Van Steen from BMO. Have I pronounced that correctly?
Yes, thank you. That's correct. Peter van Steen.
Thank you. Chris Field from Majedi. Chris Field. Not yet. Okay. James Mowat from Majedi. Hello, are you there? Not yet. Okay. Cindy Rose from Majedi. Alex Cook from Aon.
Yes, present.
Very good. Louis from Aon.
No, he's just struggling to dial in.
Okay, but we know Louis will be with us soon. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions.
Present, Chair.
Debbie Sharp, Pensions Administration Manager.
Present, Chair.
James Walton, Interim Executive Director of Resources.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, present.
And Tim Ward, Committee Officer.
Yes, present.
Very good. Is there anyone else present who's not been mentioned? No. Very good. Well, we'll move on to item 1 on the agenda, apologies and substitutions. Can the committee officer please confirm if there are any apologies and substitutions?
Yes, Chair, we've received apologies from Councillor Malcolm Smith. There are no substitutions.
Very good. I'd also like to take this opportunity to welcome Byron Cook to his first meeting of the committee. Byron is a non-voting co-opted member and employee representative for Telford and Wrekin Council. Byron, you're very welcome. Have you arrived yet? Not yet. No, I'll welcome him again when he's actually arrived. We've dealt with item 2, disclosure of pecuniary interest. This has already been dealt with in the initial roll call of the meeting. Item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. To confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of September 2020. I move that, as chair, that the minutes of the Pensions Committee meeting held on the 18th of September, as circulated with the agenda papers, be signed as a correct record. Can I have a seconder, please?
Brian Williams, I'll second.
Thank you very much, Brian. I will now accept these minutes as a true record unless anyone else indicates differently. Very good. I accept. Yes, Justin, did you want to say something? No. Well, I accept the minutes as being a true record. Item 4, public question time. We've had 6 questions from members of the public. In addition, we don't actually have on our agenda a slot for members' questions, but I've used my discretion and I'm allowing Councillor Dean to ask a question in the public session as if it was a member's question. That means he has asked a question, received a written response, and he can therefore ask a supplementary question to which he will also receive a written response. So, Julian, would you please? Well, I think first of all we better actually read out Julian's initial question. So I'll ask. Sorry, I've jumped ahead of myself. Sorry, yes, we've received 6 questions. Yes, just before we get into the questions, I would just like to make a statement. I'd like to reiterate to everyone posing questions that we really value the engagement we're receiving from the public, particularly around climate change, which forms the basis of most of the questions we receive each meeting. I do want to make it clear that many of the answers we give at the moment are probably not going to fully resolve the matter, the particular issues being raised, and in some cases may not feel particularly satisfactory. The reason for this is that the Pensions Committee is embarked on an extensive programme of work to understand all aspects of its responsibilities and the options available to it for managing the risk of climate change. We are not restricting ourselves to simplistic arguments about financial return or divestment. We are looking to understand how we can fulfil our responsibilities to the pension fund, how we can adequately manage risk, and how we have a positive impact on climate change and responsible investment generally. This programme of work needs to be completed before we can provide answers that do justice to the questions being raised. So while I welcome public questions, and I welcome the level of engagement we're seeing, and I welcome the challenges these questions pose, I must ask that we are afforded the time to make the right decisions on the back of clear, independent and extensive evidence from the experts in these fields. We'll now go on to the questions, and I will ask Justin Bridges to read the questions, and James Walton will give the response. As I say, in this first case, I'm treating Councillor Julian Dean's question as a member's question, so we will go through that process, and then Julian, you have the right to ask a supplementary if you wish. So Justin, will you please read out Councillor Julian Dean's question?
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. Earlier this year, Shropshire Council, the administering authority for Shropshire County Pension Fund, agreed the following: to instruct the acting Chief Executive to write to the Pension Fund Committee asking the committee to follow best practice by 1. Adding a statement to their strategy that climate change constitutes financial risk to the fund. 2. Setting a 3-year timescale for the reinvestment of funds currently invested in fossil fuel dependent assets. And 3. Developing an investment strategy consistent with sustainable development goals and developing a local sustainable economy. How has the committee responded to this direction set by full council?
Thank you, and may we have the response please from James Walton?
Thank you, Chair. So James Walton here as the Shropshire County Pension Fund Pension Scheme Administrator. The response is the Pension Committee is currently embarked on an extensive programme of work to understand all aspects of its responsibilities and the options available to it for managing the risk of climate change. And to date, the committee have received a climate risk report, issued a public TCFD report and media release, and are receiving further presentations at today's meeting from LGPS Central, BMO and Magedi on climate risk, engagement and responsible investment. The recommendations agreed as part of this process are included in the public TCFD report, and Shropshire County Pension Fund is one of the first pension funds in the country to disclose this information. The Pension Committee is working towards developing a separate climate strategy and climate stewardship plan, which will be published in the next 9 to 12 months. And that concludes the response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Julian, do you wish to ask a supplementary question?
Yes, please. With regards to, I think the main question, I suppose, is more to the chair than to James. So I understand the work that's going on in terms of risk assessment, but as the report that's coming to committee today says, the committee is responsible for investment strategy, which includes the fund's responsible investment beliefs. And those beliefs surely are informed by the decision of Shropshire Council, but also by other stakeholders, the letter that's been received from Telford, the decisions of councils in Wem, in Shrewsbury, in Much Wenlock, in Oswestry and elsewhere. And my real concern is that that set of beliefs, which I assume should be informing the work of the Pensions Committee, has not yet appeared on the agenda. And you know, at what stage does the Pensions Committee take cognizance of what it is being told by all these various stakeholders? I think that's my primary question. Other questions relating to the measurement of risk, and there are certainly things there that I would challenge. I think I'll leave for discussion in in the body of the meeting. Thank you.
Well, I think you'll find that your question will be answered during the process of the meeting, but we are actually embarking on, as I said in my statement, quite an extensive programme of work, and once we've undertaken that, we can progress matters. Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move on to the first of our 6 public questions. The first question is Paul Cooper. If Justin, please, you can read that Mr. Cooper's question.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. The question is, a Freedom of Information request in August 2020 asked for a full picture of Shropshire County Pension Fund's investments in fossil fuels and renewables. In reply, Shropshire County Pension Fund stated that it did not hold this information. In that case, Shropshire Council cannot be sure that the pension fund is only investing in companies or assets that do not contravene Council's policies. Will Shropshire County Pension Fund do their duty as responsible councillors by obtaining this vital information and making public all the companies that pensioners' money is invested in? Thank you.
And the response, please.
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. The majority of the pension fund's investments are held in pooled funds. The monthly reports received from its investment managers detail the units held in the pooled fund and the current value, not the underlying investments. Under the Freedom of Information legislation, information can only be provided if that information is held. Details of segregated mandates held with investment managers which do list underlying investments are supplied. The pension fund releases an annual report each year which details all the current investment managers, the asset class the manager invests in, and details of the top 10 holdings of the fund, which is publicly available and on the pension fund's website. The fund also releases information about the pooled funds in which it invests. And that concludes the response.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Jamie Russell, sent on behalf of 2 Shropshire children, daughter Alice Russell and her friend. The question, please.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. In September, we wrote a letter to you, along with over 100 other children from Shropshire, asking you to stop investing in fossil fuels because we are worried about the climate crisis and our future. We were sad that we never received a reply to our letter from you. Recently, we watched the documentary A Life on Our Planet by Sir David Attenborough. He warns that the planet is in danger and says it's crazy that our banks and our pension funds are investing in fossil fuels when these are the very things jeopardising the future we are saving for. Is Sir David Attenborough right, yes or no?
And the response, please.
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. A response to the public question submitted to the Pension Committee meeting on the 18th of September was read out during the meeting and is also included on the Council's website with all the other public questions submitted to Pension Committee. Pensions Committee is currently in the process of reviewing the impact of climate change on the fund under different climate risk scenarios as previously advised. Last week, the fund issued its public TCFD report and a press release which can be found on the pensions website. Further discussions on this important issue are being discussed at today's meeting and at future Pensions Committee meetings. That concludes the response.
Thank you very much. And our next question is from Chris Welsh.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. The question is, Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin councils together provided 60% of last year's employer contributions. Both of these councils have called on the fund to divest, and more are joining them, e.g. Oswestry, Shrewsbury, Muchwen, Wen Town councils. Shropshire County Pension Fund's investment strategy statement states that Shropshire Council is the administering authority for the fund, and that the authority's policy on social, environmental and corporate governance considerations should be taken into consideration in selection, non-selection, retention and realisation of investments. The authority, Shropshire Council, has made a clear statement on environmental policy and investments via the motion to divest passed in July 2020. In addition, the Shropshire County Pension Fund TCFD report, December 2020 states, roles and responsibility of the fund are set out clearly in the fund's governance compliance statement. Overall responsibility for managing the fund lies with Shropshire Council, which has delegated the management and administration of the fund to the Shropshire County Pension Fund Committee. Since Shropshire Council, fully supported by Telford and Wrekin and other councils, has delivered a divestment message, by what powers is Shropshire County Pension Fund ignoring the wishes of the responsible administering authority of the fund? Thank you.
And the response, please.
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. Shropshire County Pension Fund follows its own policies on social, environmental and corporate governance considerations, which have been approved by the Pension Committee. Shropshire Council does not have a policy which the pension fund should follow when considering investment decisions. Overall responsibility for managing the fund lies with the Pension Committee, not Shropshire Council. That concludes the response.
Thank you. And our next question is from Mr. Dave Ashdown.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. Question is, in October 2018, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, released a landmark report which is informing the world's response to the climate emergency. The report states urgent and unprecedented decarbonation is needed by 2030 in order to keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, beyond which even half a degree will significantly worsen the risks of drought, floods, extreme heat and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. Yesterday, we left a copy of the IPCC report at Shire Hall for the Pension Fund Committee to look at as it considers the findings of its own recent climate risk report. Would the committee be kind enough to advise us, A, which members have already read the UN IPCC report, and B, which members will be willing to do so before the next Pension Fund Committee meeting? Thank you.
Thank you. And the response, please.
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. All relevant information will be made available to Pension Committee members working within scales and ahead of making decisions. That concludes the response. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Gillian Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. Question is, Shropshire County Pension Fund states that the policy of engaging with fossil fuel companies is more effective than divestment or the threat of divestment. Specifically focusing on fossil fuel companies, when was the engagement policy drawn up by Shropshire County Pension Fund? On what evidence was the conclusion reached that engagement is more effective than divestment, and who was responsible for agreeing it? Thank you.
Thank you. And the response, please.
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. Shropshire County Pension Fund has been engaging with the companies in which it invests for many years. It uses an external provider, BMO, to do this on the fund's behalf, and they are presenting at today's meeting regarding the engagement rather than divestment. This forms part of the programme of work that the Pensions Committee will be undertaking over the next 9 to 12 months. Each year, the fund agrees with BMO the engagement priorities which are reported quarterly to Pensions Committee. Climate change is one of those priorities. Thank you, Chair.
And we also have another question as well. Justin.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. The second part of that question is, what instructions were given to the fund's stewardship partners over engagement with fossil fuel companies? Please outline exactly what Shropshire County Pension Fund stated that it wishes to achieve with respect to fossil fuel companies and is compliant with the Paris Agreement, one of the Shropshire County Pension Fund's aims for engagement. If no instructions were given, please say so.
And the response.
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. The response is that an update will be provided by BMO at today's meeting. That concludes the response. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And our, I think, final question comes from Joanna Blackman in a series of parts again, I think. So if we could have the first part, please, Justin.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. The question is, Shropshire County Pension Fund's Climate-Related Disclosures Report, December 2020, describes 3 plausible climate scenarios and concludes that the impact of a 2-degree, 3-degree and 4-degree of global heating on annual returns would be minimal, i.e. in the range of plus 0.05% to 0.1%. However, scientists across the world agree that even a 1.5 degree, billions will experience food and water shortages, and that a 2-degree world would be catastrophic. We are now at 1.3 degree heating and are already seeing devastating flooding, wildfires and increasing numbers of super strength hurricanes. One example of many, Dr. Peter Carter, MD, expert reviewer for the IPCC. First part of the question is, how confident is the Pensions Committee that the report is fit for purpose, given the huge discrepancies between the projections in the report and those of climate scientists?
Thank you. And may we have the response, please?
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. The climate scenario analysis was undertaken using the services of Mercer LLC. Mercer have been a pioneer in this field since 2011, making continual improvements to their model over the years. Their current model captures developments in the collective understanding of environmental science and climate change related political and technical developments since 2015. This draws on Cambridge Econometrics Global E3ME model with comprehensive regional and sector data. E3ME is recognised globally as one of the leading models of comprehensive economic modelling of policy and technology scenarios. The 3 climate change scenarios were developed using existing climate change models and through an extensive literature review. The fund remains conscious that climate scenario analysis requires by necessity the use of assumptions about an inherently unpredictable phenomenon, and as such, the results are viewed with these limitations in mind. We think, however, that investors looking to manage climate risk proactively ought to attempt an interface to the best explanation, and this is what the fund has aimed to do throughout this report. The fund will review its techniques and tools for assessing climate risk as additional methodologies develop. That concludes that element of the question.
Okay, and may we have the next part of the question, please, Justin?
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. Part B of the question is, why does the report not address the scenario of 1.5 degree heating? Does it consider that this is now unachievable? Thank you.
And the response, please.
Yeah, James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. Response is, at the time of the tendering process in 2019, data limitations meant the service provider had not yet developed a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. It is likely that a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario will be developed by the service provider in due course as climate change integrated assessment models are updated to consider such a scenario. In future climate scenario analysis, the fund will consider including a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario if data quality and models permit. That concludes that response. Thank you.
Thank you. And just in the final part of this question, please.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. Part C of the question is, the report states, over the coming decade, a 2 degrees Celsius outcome is, according to the model used, the best climate scenario from a returns perspective, adding 0.05% in annual returns to the asset allocation on a timeline to 2030. Does Shropshire County Pension Fund accept its responsibilities, alongside others, to do everything in its power to avert 2 degrees Celsius of global heating? Or is the fund reassured by LGPS Central's assessment that a 2 degrees Celsius world would lead to a marginal improvement in annual returns? Thank you.
And the response.
Thank you, Chair. James Walton, Pension Scheme Administrator. The fund believes in seeking out the best available climate-related research in order to make its portfolio as robust as possible. Since Mercer's analysis identifies that the fund would perform better in a 2 degrees Celsius scenario, Shropshire County Pension Fund is of the view that the implementation of climate policies aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement would be to the fund's benefit, given the model's assumption. Though it's through its pooling company, LGPS Central, Shropshire County Pension Fund is involved in a number of engagements that are aiming to get companies to align their business strategies with the Paris Agreement, which sets out high-level goals of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or well below. As alluded to in the answer to question 2, a 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario is being explored from a climate modelling perspective. Through a collaborative engagement initiative with LGPS Central, which LGPS Central is a part of, Climate Action 100+, we ask the world's largest emitters across sectors to set an ambition to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 across all material GHG emissions. Further to this, companies are asked to establish medium-term targets or goals consistent with a global reduction in emissions of 45% by 2030 relative to 2010 levels. The latter is in line with keeping the average global temperature increase to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that concludes the response. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And that concludes public questions. We'll now move on to item 5, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. Can the representatives from LGPS Central please introduce themselves and present this item?
Good morning. I hope you're all well, and thank you for having me. My name is Laura Mickey, and I'm part of the LGPS Central Responsible Investment and Engagement team as an RI&E junior analyst. I'm also joined by 2 of my colleagues who are on the call, Millie, who is also an RI&E junior analyst, and Val, who is our stewardship manager. I'd just like to check, is the TCFD report going to be going on the presentation?
Do you mean up on the screen?
Yes.
Is that the case, officers?
If I may, Chair, no, the presentation won't be put on the screen, but all members of Pensions Committee have been sent copies. So if you're able to just go through it and indicate which page you're on, then everyone should be able to follow. Thank you.
Absolutely, that's fine. Okay, so today I'm going to talk through the Shropshire County Pension Fund's TCFD report, and I will touch on some of the next steps for the fund. Please ask any questions as we go through the report, and we will also have some time at the end of the presentation to take any questions. So as many of you will be aware, in September the fund received a detailed climate risk report. And due to confidentiality provisions agreed with service providers, this climate risk report could not be made public. However, keen to be fully transparent with their stakeholders and members, Shropshire County Pension Fund have taken the findings of this report and disclosed them in a publicly available TCFD report. The TCFD was created by Mark Carney in 2015, and it stands for Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. At its essence, it acknowledges climate change as financially material. The TCFD has become something of a global standard for how organisations should report on their approach to managing climate risk. And as I've mentioned, the TCFD report is a condensed and public version of the climate risk report and includes the high-level findings. It is not currently a requirement for local authority pension funds like Shropshire to produce this type of report, and doing so does place Shropshire in the top quartile of pension funds in the UK for climate-related transparency. Given the direction of travel, there is also a chance that future regulations may make TCFD reporting mandatory for LGPS funds, And if this were the case, the fund would be very well prepared. So just before I go into the pillars, the TCFD recommendations consist of 4 main pillars, which are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The 4 pillars are supported by a number of specific disclosures the fund should report against. For this report, we have followed the TCFD recommendations for asset owners that you can find listed in the Appendix 1. As it is the fund's ambition to create and implement a climate strategy next year, this has been referenced throughout the report. And the TCFD report will be updated to include the key messages from the climate strategy once it has been finalised. So I'm going to touch on each pillar and pull out the key messages for each disclosure. As I've said, all the content of this report has come from the climate risk report, which we purposely structured in line with the TCFD pillars. So if we begin on page 7, on the first TCFD pillar, which is governance. This pillar relates to the fund's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. So the first recommended disclosure is to describe the board's oversight of climate risks and opportunities. Now, this includes actions such as responsibilities of different parties, how often those parties meet, and how progress is tracked over time. The different roles of the Pension Committee and the Pensions Board and also Shropshire Council are described in relation to responsible investment and climate risk as well. Of course, you will all be very familiar with these governance arrangements, but I will just comment on some of them for the wider audience. So the Pension Committee meets at least 4 times a year and is responsible for setting the investment strategy, which includes the responsible investment beliefs of the fund. Quarterly engagement reports from LGPS Central, other external investment managers and BMO are reviewed by the Pension Committee regularly. The Pension Committee will also receive training every quarter on responsible investment and climate change. As I already mentioned, the fund are commendably planning to implement a climate strategy in 2021. And once this has been finalised and the responsibilities of overseeing its implementation have been set, the fund's next TCFD report will be updated to include those governance arrangements. The second governance TCFD recommended disclosure is to describe the management's role in assessing and managing climate risks and opportunities. So within this section, the main messages are that the scheme administrator and the head of Treasury and Pensions have overall responsibility on how climate risks and opportunities are managed. However, that most of the implementation of climate risk management has been delegated to the fund's portfolio managers. The fund's investment advisor, Aon, also provides continued support to the fund, for example, in the form of quarterly monitoring reports, which include responsible investment where applicable. So if we move on to page 8, the second TCFD pillar, which is strategy. The strategy pillar is concerned with the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunity on the fund's business strategy and financial planning. The TCFD make 3 recommended disclosures relating to strategy. The first 2 of these relate to how short, medium and long-term climate-related risks and opportunities are identified and their impact on the fund's, like I said, business strategy and financial planning. So we have here a table that summarises kind of the key climate risks and which asset classes will be affected by those risks. These risks are, of course, constantly evolving. Some examples of the short-term risks include technological changes, policy tightening, while some of the physical risks will stretch over the longer term and include things such as flooding. And in terms of strategy, as you'll be aware, the fund is looking for further ways to embed climate risks and opportunity into its investment strategy, including potentially exploring sustainable asset allocations. So moving on to the third strategy-related disclosure, which is carrying out climate scenario analysis. So this disclosure focuses on the resilience of the investment strategy, particularly under different climate change scenarios. The TCFD recommend including a 2-degree or lower scenario. For this, an external service provider, Mercer, was used to conduct the climate scenario analysis on the fund's strategic asset allocation. The scenarios that were considered were a 2-degree, a 3-degree and a 4-degree scenarios, with timeframes until 2030 and 2050. So a 1.5-degree scenario was not included in the analysis due to data and modelling limitations at the time of the tendering process in 2019. It is likely that a 1.5-degree scenario will be developed by the service provider in due course as climate change integrated models are updated to consider such a scenario. And for future climate scenario analysis, a 1.5-degree will be considered if models do permit it. There are two kind of key findings from the climate scenario analysis that I'd just like to draw out. Firstly, that the fund's asset allocation appears to be relatively robust in all three climate change scenarios. And secondly, that the lowest temperature rise scenario, the 2-degree outcome, is the best climate scenario analysis scenario for the fund from a returns perspective. I would also just like to emphasise that climate scenario analysis is not a prediction. It does involve making assumption, and it is by no means a deterministic forecast of what will happen. Currently, there is a great deal of uncertainty for investors around the market reaction to climate risks, climate change and changing climate policy. So whilst climate change scenario analysis is not perfect science, it can help investors to better understand the short, medium and long-term climate change risks associated with plausible climate change scenarios, and to understand the portfolio sensitivities to such scenarios. It is in this respect that the fund have utilised the method. The fund does remain fully conscious that the method's limitations, and has consequently used a number of other tools to gain a fuller sense of the level of climate risk it is facing. Moving on to the third TCFD pillar, which is risk management, and that is on page 12. The risk management pillar relates to the process used by the fund to identify, assess and manage climate-related risks. Again, there are 3 TCFD recommended disclosures, and these sections describe how the identification and assessment of climate-related risks are primarily the responsibility of fund managers appointed by Shropshire. And that the fund monitors these external managers on a regular basis, including their engagement and voting activity relating to climate change. So these sections also describe through which channels, engagements and voting are conducted on behalf of the fund. So if we look at table 3, it lists the fund stewardship partners, which are LGPS Central, EOS at Federated Hermes, LAP and EMO. The risk management section also references a climate stewardship plan. This is something that the fund proactively have decided to create based off the recommendations of the climate risk report. So the climate risk report recommended that certain companies are prioritised for engagement and monitoring based on criteria such as perceived level of climate risk, the carbon risk metrics, the weight of the company in the portfolio, and things like this. So the Climate Stewardship Plan acts as a watch list for these companies, whereby the fund requests regular updates on engagement and engagement process from external managers who hold these companies. The risk management section then concludes with 3 engagement examples. And these examples really showcase how engagements have led to positive outcomes with these companies. I will not touch upon the engagements, as I understand that following the presentation we will be joined by BMO, who will be presenting on responsible engagement. Moving on now to the final pillar of the TCFD, which is metrics and targets on page 19. So this section is about the metrics and targets used to assess and manage climate risks and opportunities. The first recommended disclosure asks for a list of the metrics used by the fund. So to assess the level of climate risks in the portfolio, the fund used, for the most part, 3 different metrics: the portfolio carbon footprint, the weight in fossil fuel reserves, and the weight in clean technology. So I'll just explain what these metrics are before we move on to the next recommended disclosure. So the portfolio carbon footprint is used by investors as a proxy for climate risk, and in particular for carbon price risk. It is calculated as the weighted average of the carbon footprints of all the portfolio holdings. The fossil fuel exposure is the portfolio weight in companies with fossil fuel reserves, thermal coal reserves, or utilities deriving more than 30% of their energy mix from coal power. It does include diversified businesses where fossil fuels reserves are one business line out of several. And finally, the exposure to clean technology is the portfolio weight in companies whose products and services include clean technology. So the next recommended disclosure asks for these metrics. So it's asking for scope 1, 2, and if appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions of the portfolio. So while the TCFD recommended disclosure only asks for greenhouse gas emissions, the fund has decided to include all 5 carbon metrics for transparency. Table 4 has the carbon risk metrics for the total equities portfolio and the global equities portfolio. And both of these portfolios are less carbon intensive than their respective benchmarks. And also in terms of weight in fossil fuel reserves, the total equities portfolio also has less exposure to all 3 fossil fuel metrics compared to benchmarks. And both of these findings are positive. The final metrics and targets TCFD recommended disclosure is to set targets in order to manage climate-related risks and opportunities. So this is something that the fund will be looking at when they are creating their climate strategy. And once this climate strategy has been finalised, any decisions made will be reflected in an updated TCFD report. So to finish off, you can find a list of all the TCFD recommendations for asset owners in Appendix 1. I would just like to touch on Appendix 2 on page 23. Appendix 2 provides the full list of recommendations and considerations from the Climate Risk Report, which the fund has commendedly included for transparency. These recommendations are structured according to the 4 TCFD pillars. So while some of the recommendations and considerations, such as the changes to the policies, can be undertaken by the fund themselves, there are several highlighted that will require some external expertise. So at a very high level, kind of the fundamental recommendations are for the fund to develop a climate strategy. And this would include things like the governance of climate risk, the fund's investment beliefs relating to climate change, the fund's objectives, and the strategic actions relating to climate change. The second kind of key recommendation is for the fund to develop a climate stewardship plan. So I've touched upon this earlier, but it would be, amongst others, to include a focus list of companies for continued engagement and monitoring. So as you'll have heard earlier, the fund has already accepted both of these recommendations. So overall, the next steps for the fund over the next 9 to 12 months are to develop a climate strategy and a climate stewardship plan. And both of these, as well as the TCFD report, are considered to be very best practice in the industry. End of our presentation on the TCFD report. Thank you very much for your time. Myself and my colleagues are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Laura, very much for the presentation. Are there any questions, please, members?
Yes, Laura Hoskinson.
Hello, Laura. Yes, please ask away.
So I've got a couple. I'll start with page 21 of the report, which is our page 31. It's talking about the fact that we're 13% below the benchmark, but I just want to ask, what does the benchmark measure? Because as far as I can tell, it's a sort of the global blended average of carbon efficiency. And at the moment, that outcome is leading to a sort of 4-degree rise in global temperatures and the environmental impacts of that. So although we're below that target, I don't know what that means, because I don't know what our goal is. Is there anything you can do to clarify what our goal would be, or if there would be a better benchmark to compare ourselves to try and have an outcome that is within the Paris Agreement?
That's a very good question. So are we talking here about the total equities, and it says the total equities blended benchmark? So the blended benchmark is made up of, so the total equities portfolio has several portfolios in it. It's all the equities portfolios. So the total equities blended benchmark is a blend of those benchmarks for each of those equities portfolios. So that's what it's measured against. You're very right that some of these things that you touched upon will come up perhaps in the climate strategy. So currently, yeah, the equities portfolio are using that as a comparative for the financials. So that's what we've used for the carbon footprint. However, if anything else were to come of that in the climate strategy is where we'd be looking at it as well. Any sort of targets or anything like that.
Thank you. I have one, but I think I'm going to wait for BMO, because that was about the engagement examples, and you said you weren't going to answer questions on that, which is fine because it's coming up later. And the final one is on page 11 of the report. That's our page 21. It's just talking about the 4-degree increase in scenario. These aren't your figures, so I don't expect you to be able to answer any questions on it. I just wanted to raise, it seems odd that with a 4% increase in global temperatures, the impact is only 0.1%. It seems an oddly small amount of impact when the predictions are it's going to be mass global change. It just seems unlikely that will be all of it, the effect it might possibly have on our current holdings. So that's more a point to make rather than a question for you. Thank you.
Chris, did you want to ask a question? Chris Mellings.
Yes, please, Chairman. A couple of points on this. Firstly, thanks for the presentation, and it's a very useful document, and on the journey that we're on, it's very helpful. If I could just start with our page 17 of the pack, which is talking about the governance arrangements. The second paragraph there refers to training and time at the AGM talking about responsible investment, and that's absolutely fine. But I wonder whether it's possible to expand that to include what's called impact investment or impact investing, because obviously there's a slight difference between the two, whereas responsible investment is around essentially doing no harm. Impact investment is about doing good. So I think we need to see the full picture to get a wider understanding of that. Then allied to that, obviously engagement is one approach to this. But as we've heard from the questions today and from other things in recent months, there is a desire to see us follow a policy of divestment. And I think we need to include that as part of the picture so that we have a full understanding of the whole picture and the implications of doing both in making judgments about where we go. And finally, just a reflection on the different scenarios 2, 3 and 4. A webinar I was at earlier this week was indicating that based on the known fossil fuel reserves there are in the world, if all those are extracted and burnt, then we're at a 4-degree scenario. So it does sound that 1.5, 2 sounds really at the lower end, unless there is really concerted action. And I know it's not just for pension funds, there's a much bigger issue, not only for the UK, but across the world as a whole. But unless we do something drastic, then if we are at that 4-degree end, then there are some serious issues, and it doesn't matter what the impact on the investment performance of the pension fund is. It's going to have some very, very bigger impact. So again, I think impact investing and understanding all about that is going to be quite helpful to us going forward. So not particularly questions as such, but if we can include something around impact investments going forward, I think we'll find that very very helpful and very useful. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Anybody else wanting to say anything? I'm having difficulty actually because with the template on the to actually see people's faces, so I can't see if you're waving to me or not. Any other questions? No. Well, in that case,
yes, please, Tom. I put it in the chat.
Well, I can't get into chat. I'm not really very techy. You'll have to sort of now. Okay, I'll let you speak on this occasion, Julian.
Thank you very much. So my question is about the climate stewardship aspect, and I suppose what I'm asking is, without a climate stewardship aspect, would it be accurate to say that there is this risk that if you were in a situation where returns on investment in companies in the UK, for example, who are moving towards decarbonisation, were beginning to fall, that actually the money could end up being then shifted over to dirtier companies, if you like, fossil fuel companies, effectively doing exactly the opposite of what we want to do. In other words, shifting funds towards fossil fuels because they get a greater return. And is the idea of a climate stewardship plan in order to mitigate against that, so that actually that decision couldn't be taken to shift investments towards fossil fuel? Yeah, I think that's my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if our stewardship manager could potentially take this question about stewardship.
Yes,
Val?
absolutely. Yes, hi there. Thank you, Laura. It's, the technology pressing the right buttons. Thank you. So the climate stewardship plan we think is quite critical, because in the end, and I'll reference an AGM I attended this week. It was hosted by an organisation called Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, and LGP Central is a member there, alongside a growing group of investors across the whole chain, investment managers and asset owners. And there were 3 high-ranking individuals who addressed the AGM. It was the CEO of the International Energy Agency. It was the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the body that is leading climate negotiations. As you know, we have a climate negotiation coming up, COP26 next year, to be hosted in Glasgow, and the Prince of Wales also addressed the audience. And I think the key message there was, from all of these individuals, was for investors to continue engagement with companies, whole sectors and whole value chains. For instance, let's take steel as an example. How can you decarbonize that production? We use steel in a whole host of infrastructure in our societies. Could scrap steel be used to a high degree? More energy efficiency, other ways of making it without relying on coking coal, as it's called. So I think, this is a broad way of answering your question. I do think that engagement with the high emitters is a high priority for a long-term investor like Shropshire Pension Fund. We would like to see well-functioning, sustainable markets, not disruption and not havoc, if you will. So the orderly transition is what we would like to see in all those companies and assets that the fund is invested in. And I think that taking BP as an example, they have investors have engaged BP over a number of years on climate change. They have very recently, this summer, they lowered their price assumption for oil and gas quite substantially in light of the decarbonisation that is happening, and they are making a shift and hoping to secure returns for their shareholders by doing that, and ramping up investments in renewable energy. And I think they're looking to become one of the biggest renewable energy players globally. So I hope that goes some way to give a perspective on why climate stewardship is important.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
I don't think it quite answers the question.
Excuse me, Julian, you're here as a guest. You're not a member of the committee. I think. Are there any other committee members that wish to speak? No. Well, in that case, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for the presentation and thank everybody for the questions. And we'll now move on to item 6 on the agenda, the climate risk report. And can I ask Justin Bridges, please, to present this item?
Chair, Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. Yeah, the climate risk report was presented at the last Pensions Committee in September, and LGPS Central have just presented the public TCFD report, which was commissioned at the last meeting, and that is attached to Appendix A to the report. You will also see at Appendix B, we have just issued a press release that was issued last week. And as you can see, and as has been discussed earlier today, we are one of the first pension funds in the country to disclose this information. Carbon emissions are 13% below the benchmark, and we have a higher allocation to renewables within the portfolios. The report highlights that all 5 equity portfolios produce lower carbon emissions than the benchmark. The committee have agreed to all the climate risk recommendations in the report, and they are detailed in the public TCFD report. And they have also agreed to develop a separate climate strategy and a separate climate stewardship plan for the fund. Again, mentioned in the report, further training is being provided today at today's meeting. BMO are presenting on engagement versus divestment, and Majedi, our UK equity manager, is also presenting on how responsible investment is integrated into their investment process. Members are asked to endorse the public TCFD report attached to Appendix A and the press release, which has been put on the Pension Fund website and released to the local media. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, please, members? No, very good. Okay. Well,
sorry, Chairman. Sorry, I was just struggling to get hold of the chat.
Yes,
Just one general comment, and this may not be the appropriate point. If it isn't, apologies for that. But it's around the sort of the stewardship sort of issue, and there's been various references of late about the United Nations 6 principles of responsible investment, and from what I can see, it appears that the pension fund specifically has not signed up to that. We're not shown on the list of signees as being one of those. I think Hampshire Pension Fund is, and there's 1 or 2 of the Scottish local authority pension funds. And I did have an exchange with Justin on the issue, and I know some of the investment managers are signed up, which is absolutely fine. But I just wonder, in the sort of the wider issues that we've been talking about, whether it's something that we as a pension fund ought to consider and perhaps ought to be signed up to as a member to help sort of underpin the work that we're embarking on. I just put that forward as a suggestion for consideration. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Any other questions? No. Well, in that case, we'll move on to the recommendations. We have 2 recommendations. The first one is that members are asked to endorse the publication of the fund's first climate risk report as set out in Appendix A on its website, formatted to comply with industry best practice as set out by the TCFD. And secondly, members are asked to note the attached press release at Appendix B, which was sent to the local media and major employers and published on the website. Can I have a proposer, please, for the recommendations?
Councillor Michael Wood, I move the recommendation as set out in 21222.
Thank you, Michael. And may I have a seconder, please? I'll second in that case. I will now accept the recommendations as set out in the report unless anyone else indicates differently. Nobody has indicated differently. Very good. We'll now move on to item 7, responsible engagement. And can I please ask for the representatives of BMO to introduce themselves and present this item, please?
Good morning, this is Dominic Delaforce from BMO, and I'll just let my colleagues introduce themselves before I start our presentation.
Good morning, my name is Alan Fitzpatrick, also from BMO Global Asset Management Responsible Investment Team.
And I'm Peter van Stijn, also from BMO Responsible Investment Team.
Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed, Chairman, for asking BMO to present to the Shropshire Pension Panel on the subject of engagement. I am the client director responsible for BMO's relationship with Shropshire, which includes both a responsible engagement mandate and also an investment in our dynamic LDI fund. And you've been a client of ours for 15 years, and we really value this long-term relationship. The three of us are going to look in detail how engagement compares with divestment, with a particular focus on how it impacts on climate change. And in summary, we believe that there are pros and cons of both engagement and divestment. And we hope you find this presentation helpful for you while you're considering how to implement climate change policy in your investment portfolio. So I'd like to start with a brief introduction to BMO's Responsible Engagement Overlay Service, or RIO as we call it. This is a service that allows investors to receive a market-leading corporate engagement service on their equity and corporate bond holdings. We also offer a proxy voting service, though I should note that Shropshire doesn't participate in this. We represent over £250 billion worth of investments, and so through RIO, you and our clients enjoy a greater influence to effect positive change by pooling assets to create one single powerful voice. We're proud to have recently celebrated our 20-year anniversary of this service. Over that time, we've engaged with thousands of different companies. And in 2019, we hit a record of 765 engagements with different firms. We have a highly qualified and stable team of sustainability experts with, on average, 10 years experience who carry out the engagement on our clients' behalf. They're based in the UK, which is where Alan and myself are, Netherlands, where Peter's based, and Canada, where our parent company, Bank of Montreal, is headquartered. We proudly represent a client base of 37 investors from around the world, and our clients entrust RIO to engage on material, environmental, social, and governance issues. So I'm now going to hand over to Alan, who's going to explain in more detail about our engagement program.
Thank you, Dominic. Hello, everyone. Alan Fitzpatrick, BMO Global Asset Management. It is worth beginning by defining what we mean by responsible investment and corporate engagement. Responsible investing can be boiled down to investing in companies that look after their workforce, who look after the environment, and have a long-term sustainable view of the world and their company. The United Nations Principles of Responsible Investment is the global governing body of responsible investment, And they define responsible investment as an approach to investment that aims to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors into investment decisions, and thereby being able to better manage risk and generate long-term sustainable returns. Environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG, refers to three central factors in measuring the sustainability and societal impact of investment in a company or business. But as you delve a little deeper into each one of these factors, it starts to become a spider web of interlinked issues. So for example, here at BMO, we break E, S, and G down into 7 themes, and underlying each of these themes are over 50 sub-themes. But it is now widely accepted that these criteria help to better determine the future financial performance of companies. This shift in institutional investor practices towards active forms of ownership indicates that more and more institutional investors recognize that their fiduciary duty to clients and beneficiaries should involve purposeful consideration, monitoring, and intervention regarding ESG factors affecting investee companies. And we define corporate engagement as the process of investors encouraging the companies they are already invested in through constructive dialogue to improve their ESG risk management or develop more sustainable business practices. And so once a list of target companies has been defined, investors then need to set feasible objectives and track the outcomes of their engagement with these companies to ensure their effectiveness. As my colleague Dominic noted at the beginning of the presentation, we have enjoyed a long-standing relationship with Shropshire spanning 15 years. And in that time, we have engaged over 1,200 companies spanning 40 individual countries on Shropshire's behalf. Now, to track and report on progress from our engagement, we log instances of change or company actions which either protect or enhance long-term shareholder value as milestones. And we have achieved over 850 of these instances of change with the companies that you have invested in over that period across environmental, social, and governance issues. But when we took a closer look at the companies where we have made the most progress through our engagement, we note that the majority of them are indeed oil and gas and mining companies. So climate change is a major issue for us when it comes to engagement. Over the last decade or so, we have engaged with companies with the aim of preventing the unmanageable effects of climate change. And with that in mind, I will now pass over to my colleague Peter, who will delve deeper into the main investment risks of climate change.
Thank you, Alan. Peter van Stijn, BMO Global Asset Management. So the investment risk of climate change, which we address in our engagement program, are transition risk, physical risk, and reputational and litigation risk. Let me start with transition risk. This risk can be divided into 2 categories. The first is transition from a world primarily using fossil fuels for energy, heat and transport, to a world primarily using clean energy. And the second category of transition risk relates to limiting greenhouse gas emissions. So starting with the shift from fossil fuels to clean energy sources. This is primarily driven by regulation and falling cost of alternative energy. And our engagement focuses on those sectors that are mostly affected by this transition. And these are oil and gas, mining, utilities, and transportation. Companies in these sectors will have to change their business models to be able to provide the energy and services that are needed in this transitioning world. The second type of transition risk, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, is driven by CO2 pricing and energy prices, and by regulation. So this transition risk mainly affects energy-intensive sectors like chemicals, steel, industrials, transportation, but also oil and gas and utilities. The companies in these sectors will have to invest in efficiency and clean technology. Going to the next type of climate risk, we go to the risk relating to physical risk. And this is the risk of increased intensity of extreme weather events like hurricanes, flooding, heat and droughts. And impacts include damage to assets, business interruptions and social unrest. So for this risk, our focus is primarily on insurance, real estate, food and beverages, agricultural and forestry, and utilities. Going to the final type of climate risk that we identified, this is reputational and litigation risk. And this risk that relates mainly to issues like the Shell New movement. This is started a few years ago after the reports from the 80s showed that the company, Shell, was aware of the risk of climate change and the effect of fossil fuels on global warming. And this has resulted in legal actions from, for instance, Friends of the Earth. And that was earlier in this week in my home country in the Netherlands, where they accused Shell of negligence and demanded a 50% CO2 reduction of the company in court. And this is an ongoing court case, which will take quite a few years or months, we expect. But this type of risk we need to address. So how do we address these climate risks through our engagement? Well, the core of our approach is clear expectations to companies. So our expectations are based on our own engagement experience as well as on best practice standards. So we have developed a clear trajectory of action, progressing through 4 steps which we require from companies when we engage with them. And the first step is for companies to show basic awareness of the issue of climate change and how it relates to their business activities. This includes disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. The next step is active emissions management, and here we expect actions to reduce the emissions for which the company is directly responsible, and it also includes setting targets and investing in efficiency projects. When we then move to the third step, we ask companies to take a strategic approach, and this means making climate change a core business issue. We expect companies to consider at board level the risks and opportunities of climate change and what it presents to their strategy. And this includes consideration of emissions across the whole value chain, of suppliers, of their own operations, and of customers. And alignment is where we expect companies to ultimately aim for, alignment with the goal of the Paris Agreement. So this step goes beyond considering the impact of climate change on the business, but we also want companies to look at the impact of the business on climate change. We want companies to actively contribute to tackling climate change through aligning their own business objective with the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement. And this is, of course, to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees. And we think that adopting such goal positions companies to be economically robust to the transition ahead. Normally, we engage directly with companies one-on-one. However, with climate change, we see strong alignment of interest among investors worldwide. So many of us want the companies we engage with to credibly manage climate risk by setting ambitious targets and developing strategies and investment programs to align their business with this transitioning world. This alignment is one of the main drivers of the success of Climate Action 100 Plus. It was mentioned earlier already. So Climate Action 100 coordinates engagement with 160 so-called systemically important companies, accounting for 2/3 of all industrial greenhouse gas emissions globally. And it's a fast-growing collaborative engagement group, which is now already signed by over 500 investors with over $50 trillion assets under management. And this makes it probably the largest collaborative engagement activity ever. So this initiative also has its asks, which are quite aligned with our own asks. And the first area is for governance. And it asks boards to be accountable and have oversight of all climate change risks and opportunities. And this requires sufficient board competence. And here we also ask for climate change related targets to be included into remuneration. Now, the second set of asks are around emissions management, and we want companies to take action and set targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050, as Val mentioned earlier. And disclosure is the third ask, and here we ask companies to provide disclosure in line with the Task Force on Climate-related financial disclosures. And last year, transparency of corporate lobbying was added as an engagement objective. And here we aim promoting positive lobbying by companies on climate regulation, but also by industry bodies. Now, Climate Action 100 uses a range of alternative engagement approaches, often in combination. It's statements at annual meetings, shareholder proposals, public letters to companies, joint statements, and then next January it will publish its first benchmark of the 160 companies, which will add a mild naming and shaming to the toolbox. So as said, the objectives of Climate Action 100 are closely aligned with our own engagement expectations, and therefore it should be no surprise that we've been an active participant in Climate Action 100 since the start. And we act as a lead investor on 7 company engagements, among which Fiat Chrysler and BHP. And we are an active participant in the engagement with a further 19 companies. And one of them is BP. And BP has always been very open to investor dialogue, and it's one of the most intensively engaged companies in the 20-year history of Rio. And our records show that the first engagement interaction dates back to 2006. So in the early years, we often discussed about incidents like a big Alaska spill in 2006, and of course the Macondo disaster in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. But we also discussed issues like human rights relating to pipeline building and transparency of payments to host countries. And in 2012, we had our first real strategic discussion about climate change with the company. And from 2050 onwards, the focus of engagement with BP on behalf of our clients has been mainly on the topic of climate change. And we achieved quite a few results, like ending membership of a US anti-climate change lobby group in 2015, but also management support for the Aiming for A resolution, shareholder resolution, which asked the company to develop a long-term strategy to manage climate risk. And in 2016, we focused on the integration of climate change strategy and targets into executive remuneration. And that year it was already introduced. So in 2017, we addressed the board at the AGM and we asked for disclosure within the framework of TCFD and to explain the underlying assumptions of climate risk management. And later that year, BP released its first energy outlook, which for the first time included a scenario describing global temperature rise, limiting to just 2 degrees. And since then, since 2017, we've had several Climate Action 100 meetings, including one with the new chairman, which asked the group to file a shareholder proposal asking BP to set targets aligned with Paris. And this resolution, which received 98% support for all shareholders, has helped the company to develop its net zero strategy, which was already earlier also mentioned. And this strategy will transition the company towards renewable energy away from oil and gas. So BP now expects to produce 40% less oil and gas by 2030 and about 20 times more renewable energy around that time. And we strongly believe that our engagement has made a real difference to the way the company is run. So BP is a good example of modern engagement, where we discuss alignment of a long-term strategy of a company with the needs of society, both from an economic and social perspective, and discussing that at board level. And now Ellen will further elaborate on the future of engagement.
Thank you, Peter. Alan Fitzpatrick, BMO Global Asset Management. So looking ahead, the mainstreaming of responsible investment has seen the focus on ethics shift to one of materiality. So in other words, when conducting engagement with companies, it is about persuading these companies to see the benefits of strong ESG management for their long-term performance. With social and environmental issues requiring now real-world action, the more fundamental question now being asked is, what is the role of the financial sector in creating a fairer and more sustainable society? So what do we think that this will look like in practice? There is a number of elements to this. The first is we believe it will there will be an increase in a multi-stakeholder approach. So that's NGOs or non-government organizations like Greenpeace, investors, governments, and indeed the private sector all working together on systemic challenges like climate change. And indeed the role of governments is essential in this. We were pleased to see the UK's 2019 groundbreaking target of hitting net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Since then, more countries such as South Korea have also followed the UK's lead on this. And indeed, more recently, you might have seen Boris Johnson's Green Industrial Revolution 10-point plan, which aims to move the UK to a low carbon economy and create an estimated 250,000 new jobs. We also expect a further shift from disclosure to action. So for listed companies, the use of voting at AGMs is a really powerful tool that can be used in combination with engagement to signal the importance of climate change action to companies, as previously demonstrated in the BP example. So investors are increasingly active in using the vote to press for progress. And this has reflected in the high number of climate change shareholder resolutions filed in recent years. And finally, we expect to see an increasing use of what we call escalation strategies. So you can engage, you can collaborate with other investors, such as the Climate Action 100 initiative, and you also have the opportunity to vote and support shareholder resolutions. And indeed, other escalation strategies include going public, or the naming and shaming or expressing your concern, and ultimately divestment. Which brings us on to our conclusion, which outlines the pros and cons between divestment and engagement. Some long-term investors have expressed concerns about the apparent inconsistency of supporting efforts to tackle climate change and holding investments in companies involved in fossil fuels. And an increasing number of funds have decided to divest entirely from either a class of fossil fuels, such as coal, or even from all types of fossil fuel. I guess the question is, if you are divesting from fossil fuels, where do you draw the line? Is it just the oil and gas majors? Or does it go beyond this and include the companies that use these products? Nevertheless, as divestment from one or more types of fossil fuel companies becomes a more widely adopted investment approach, there is enough evidence to suggest that engagement can be a more effective tool in climate change mitigation efforts. So when weighing up whether to engage or divest, it is important to consider carefully the objective of the investor and the likelihood of success under each approach. So for divestment, you can argue that divestment on the grounds of robust financial analysis of the risks and opportunities is entirely justified. And similarly, divestment for any other reason may be justified on ethical grounds too. Although, while it can send a signal to policymakers of investors' frustration at the lack of progress towards tackling climate change, one could argue that divestment is unlikely to contribute to the core objective that is mitigating climate change, that is reducing the supply or demand of fossil fuels. There are question marks about whether divestment is likely to succeed in changing global levels of either supply or demand of fossil fuel production. Firstly, the new owner of that divested stock wants to see his or her investment pay a return and will almost certainly have fewer concerns about climate change risks. On the other hand, for engagement, and this is all about influencing corporate behavior to improve long-term performance and mitigate damaging practices. So on things like product and strategy, it can really be quite an effective tool. And in addition, by encouraging companies to disclose more information on their risk to low carbon scenarios, corporate engagement can help to improve the prospects of tackling climate change at the same time as reducing the investment risk and improving the returns of investments in the fossil fuel industry itself. But it must be noted that effective engagement has its own challenges. Firstly, it can take time to engage and see a company action the desired change. We need companies to be willing to engage with investors, and indeed this has proven to be less effective with semi-state or state-owned companies. For our own actively managed portfolios at BMO Global Asset Management, our fund managers believe there are plenty of opportunities to achieve outperformance without oil and gas. We even run strategies which exclude these sectors. And if you look at many ESG funds, this can be identified as one of the key drivers of strong performance, particularly through the pandemic and the economic downturn. However, taking the viewpoint of an investor that still holds the shares through this year's economic downturn, one could argue that this might not be the best moment to sell that stock, and indeed in doing so you lock in the loss. So engagement is one way that can help turn around the company towards more profitable business practices, which will hopefully help to recover that loss. So to conclude, when assessing the merits of a divestment or engagement strategy, either approach is entirely justifiable, but be aware that there are a number of pros and cons to each. And it's important to consider these in any decision and to be clear on the underlying motivations or objectives behind such a decision.
So, Chairman, it's Dominic Delaforce from BMO. That concludes our presentation. We'd be delighted to take any questions you've got.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions, please, members? Brian.
Chairman, Brian here. Can I have a word on presentation, please? If my screen is the same as everybody else's, I've got 90% of it covered with the title of the item in the agenda and a series of tiny figures across the bottom of the screen, which I find it difficult to concentrate on what they're saying when I'm squinting at them. Would it be possible to take off the title of the item, and so that we can see those who are making presentations in rather greater size than one can at the moment? We all know what we're discussing, or I think we all know which item we're discussing, and I fail to see why we need to have the whole screen taken up with the title of the item at the expense of being able to see have the pleasure of seeing those who are presenting the item.
Okay.
So
okay.
can we make a change to that?
I think we'll probably have to look at that possibly for the next meeting, Brian, but we'll take that on board.
Chair, I've got a different view, and I don't know how I got it, and sorry I just shared my screen, but I actually have 9 people I can see with the little icon in the corner, so it is possible to do it, but I don't know how I did it.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Well, I certainly haven't got it, and I don't know how to do it.
No. Okay. Well, coming back to the report, time is pressing a little bit. Are there any other questions on the report, on the presentation?
Yes, I do. Laura Hoskisson.
Laura, yes, please go ahead, Laura.
Hello. Back in one of the previous presentations, there were some engagement examples on page 18 of their report and our page 28. And you've got engagement examples of Barclays, BP and Royal Dutch Shell. The BP one you spoke about in more detail. It was good to see that BP are making some really strong changes in their business plan to try and switch over to clean energy. Royal Dutch Shell was an interesting example because it showed much less engagement with you and much less intention to do anything. They've said maybe they've got a long-term net zero aligned plan, but they haven't shown any progress on implementing any of those plans. So when you're in this situation, how do you define whether this is engagement that's worth continuing with? Where do you tip between this is positive, we're making a change, and we should just get out because we're clearly not making any positive difference?
Okay, just to make it clear, because we are purely doing engagement, we don't have the ability to make the decision to divest. So all we can do is to keep on trying to engage. I think that's a question you need to ask to Majedi, who are giving the next presentation. But I think maybe Peter, do you want to make a few quick comments on this engagement? Because just to pick up on that point.
Yeah, so we actively track the level of success of our engagement and whether we can actually still expect some changes to be happening. And for instance, in the Shell case, the company clearly states that that it will develop its strategy. It is currently developing, and it will come out with a strategy in the beginning of next year. So in that sense, we continue the engagement and continue to push for a strong and a strong strategy, which is aligned with what's needed for Paris. And we definitely informed them that they were leading as being the first, setting an ambition that included the use of its products, and it's now being it has become a laggard in the industry, and it needs to catch up. So here we definitely continue with the engagement. Looking at other companies like, for instance, Exxon, that's a total different story, and there we the complete group of climate action has indeed almost all have concluded that engagement is not really working anymore, and here we immediately go to the route of going to the shareholders meeting and address the board there, because there's no other way we can actually discuss issues with the company. So it's a case-by-case situation, and it's often also the engager itself making that judgment, but we try to be as transparent as possible about it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that. It was very, very thought-provoking. I think we'll now move on straight away to item 8, how Majedi integrates ESG into their investment process. And can I ask the representatives of Majedi, please, to introduce themselves and present this item?
Thank you very much, Chairman. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning about responsible engagement. I'm Cindy Rose, Head of Responsible Capitalism at Majedi Asset Management. With me is Chris Field, one of our founding members and a fund manager on our UK desk. He is the fund manager of your portfolio at Shropshire. We are pleased to speak with you this morning about our investment process and how ESG fits into that process and impacts your fund. We have managed assets for Shropshire for 15 years and value this relationship. We also value your interest in ESG and climate change. The purpose of our presentation today is to explain how we are an active manager. We demonstrate active management by integrating ESG considerations into the investment decisions that impact your fund. We will also illustrate how we engage with companies on your behalf and show how our ESG analysis and ESG focused engagements impact the investment decisions that shape your portfolio. Majedi is an independent specialty manager, and ESG fits naturally within our structure. As an active manager, we integrate ESG considerations into our mainstream investment process, which is the process we use for your fund. We look at what is material to each holding, including ESG factors. We vote our proxies for all of your investments. And importantly, we can sell shares in companies that don't take corrective actions or listen to our feedback. This means that we're in a position to exert change on a company that we hold on behalf of Shropshire County Council. We actively manage a UK equity portfolio for Shropshire. This fund has flexibility to hold up to 20% in overseas companies. Our overriding objective is to meet the investment target while protecting Shropshire's interests. We have consistently engaged with companies since our appointment by Shropshire in 2005. We have also continued to develop our ESG thinking and our ESG resource to benefit the investments that we make on your behalf. On slide 4 of our presentation, you can see our mainstream ESG integration process, which is the process we use for Shropshire's fund. This process includes the consideration of ESG factors, which may have a direct impact on our investment decisions for your fund. The first step in the process that we use for your fund is idea generation. Here we scour the market for sound investment ideas. The next step is our fundamental research, where we look closely at accounting and operational factors, but also consider macroeconomic themes. Importantly, as part of this step, we undertake what we call materiality assessments, and these look at ESG factors as well as financial factors to help us understand where each company's greatest exposures lie. Sometimes companies' greatest exposures and opportunities and risks are in the area of climate change. Chris is going to provide examples of companies that we have engaged with about their climate change risks in just a moment. We then engage our holdings on the key issues, or the most material issues, that we have prioritized for each of our companies. We assign a resiliency score, which is based really on how well a company is managing its own particular issues or areas. We track outcomes from engagement over time, and we report back to our clients on any improvements that are made. This is certainly the case for climate change issues. Then, based on all of our analysis of a company, including the material ESG issues, we also assign what we call a conviction score, which indicates how convicted we are, or how sure we are, that a company should be part of the portfolio. This score is really important because it affects not only the weightings of the holdings in your portfolio, but also our buy, sell, and hold decisions for the fund. And finally, we have a robust oversight process. This continually challenges our investment thinking and choices. It helps ensure that we're sticking with our ESG integration process and making the best possible investment decisions for Shropshire. So Chris is now going to talk about some of the holdings in the portfolio.
Thanks very much. This year is going to see the production of Majeddi's 10th Responsible Capitalism publication, which reviews the highlights over the year of our engagement with companies in which we invest on behalf of you, our clients. The report will disclose to you where we've had good successes in persuading companies of policy or strategy change, and also where management teams have been too slow, frankly, in addressing shortcomings, which you may well have led us as active managers to sell a position in that company. You'll see on page 5, we're pleased that actually Majeddi's principles for investing responsibly have been highly rated by the independent and widely recognised international benchmark for asset managers in this sphere, the PRI rating. That's at the bottom of slide 5. Now, as an investment team, we've always prioritised the key issues, so the risks and opportunities of companies, when we engage in dialogue with the management teams of these companies. And we have hundreds of meetings a year with the C-suite within those companies. Now, part of the job in assessing an investment opportunity from our perspective is gathering evidence to determine whether or not the CEO or the board is doing a good or bad job at managing the most material risks and opportunities. There's plenty of empirical evidence to suggest that those companies that actually lead in setting the standards for environmental, social or governance policies are better investments than the laggards. And today we believe that's actually more important than ever for two reasons. First is legislation, which we think is likely to tighten around best practices, and also taxes, which we think will be introduced to incentivize good behavior, and which ultimately I think leaves the laggards exposed. And secondly, the investors, such as yourselves, are becoming more active and less tolerant of these companies with poor practices. And they will, we think, increasingly be shunned by the investment community. So in our view, this will lead to an even greater valuation disparity between those companies that manage these issues well and those that manage them badly. Now, for a number of years now, we've been engaging with Royal Dutch Shell and BP, and Cindy's been an integral part of these discussions. Now, this is really about their strategy to transition away from fossil fuels. These engagements have been at the board level in both cases, and now oil is going to remain part of the world's energy mix, really for some time to come. But we've said that these companies, we've said to these companies that we really want them to articulate a clear strategy with clear goalposts and milestones over time for the executives to be aiming for in order to achieve that net zero carbon emission target in 2050. Now, furthermore, we've been insisting on a material part of the executives' remuneration being based on hitting these milestones. Frankly, if we don't have that in place, we think the executives will have other incentives and will manage the companies accordingly. So we can apply this pressure knowing that ultimately we can sell as active managers in the event the company fails to respond to our requests. Now, Royal Dutch Shell, we've been talking to them for many years, and I think they were leaders actually in the field, and I think the engagements we've had with them, we think they've responded incredibly well. Now we do know that they're going to present their full transition strategy early next year, but we believe it remains actually as one of the leading fossil fuel companies to develop a strategy which from our perspective will tick all the boxes. Now, importantly, the management is incentivized to hit milestones that we think will form part of this route to net zero carbon by 2050. And we expect to hear much more early in the new year from Royal Dutch Shell on this. Now, BP, on the other hand, we've been engaging with them for a long time, and they presented their strategy in September. And I think it's very laudable what they've done in terms of encouraging investment, huge investment into renewable energy. But it does raise the question whether they are the best positioned company to actually achieve those targets, and actually whether they can make those investments generate a sufficient return. So from an investment perspective, we think it's fantastic to invest in renewables, which is a growing part of, will become a growing part of the economy. But from our perspective, we need to be comfortable that they have A, the expertise, and B, that the returns are likely to be good. And I think the other issue for us that we have with BP is that the management aren't incentivized sufficiently they're not aligned enough really to achieve the clear milestones that we think they need to get to net zero carbon by 2050. And without those incentives, we think the behavior of managements will actually not help to meet those objectives. So we've taken the view that actually BP's strategy actually won't be good for investors. And actually we have, as active managers over the last 2 years, sold virtually all of our shares in BP. Now, I would expect the rest actually to be sold quite soon. We've sold down basically 90% of the holding for you in BP. We have, in terms of Royal Dutch Shell, over the last 2 years, we've taken that position down materially as well, almost halved, and combined the little bit of BP and Shell represents 3.2% of the fund invested in fossil fuels. So as I said, this is mostly Royal Dutch Shell, which we think is one of the leaders actually in transitioning away from fossil fuels to net zero carbon emissions. It's also worth mentioning that Shell is working with its industrial customers to reduce their carbon footprints through renewable and more energy efficient solutions, which we think is making a valuable contribution to a sustainable future, as well as offering attractive growth opportunities for Royal Dutch Shell. Now, to add a bit more colour to how we're approaching ESG in our investments, I'd cite Mondi as an example. Now, Mondi is a large manufacturer of specialty paper and cardboard. Many of the heavy industries that exist in the world today are big emitters of carbon, and Mondi would be one of these. But we recognise that the world still needs many of these industries. So for us, it's about investing in those companies that are managing their risks and opportunities well, and their environmental obligations. And in Mondi's case, they're making every effort to reduce their carbon footprint through investing in projects to minimise their energy consumption. Mondi's also set very ambitious goals to reduce its emissions by about 1/3 by 2025. It manages its forests sustainably and produces paper and cardboard products that are increasingly replacing plastic equivalents. So Mondi is investing in product innovation to reduce packaging for consumer products. And we recently wrote to the CEO after a meeting we had with him to encourage him to consider increasing the spend on research and development in this area, given the growth opportunities for more sustainable packaging solutions. Now, we're excited by the opportunities that exist for those companies that are focused on providing solutions to the world's biggest problems. Impact investing, really, as we heard earlier on in this meeting. And that does include reducing packaging materials, but it also, of course, includes reducing greenhouse emissions. Now, if I can turn to slide 6, we show the carbon footprint of the fund that we manage for you, Shropshire Council, and you'll see that it's been falling over the last 12 months. Now, with the risks of governments around the world increasing taxes and legislation to change behaviour and to address carbon emissions, we think this downward trend in the carbon footprint of the fund will continue. And finally, I thought on the next slide we'd give an example on slide 7 of a company that's working hard to help mining companies reduce their carbon footprint through innovative new products. Now, mining companies have also been held up as huge carbon emitters, and they are. Weir Group is the company. It manufactures mining equipment, and now, as big emitters of greenhouse gases, we clearly need to bear that in mind when we come to investing in them. But at the same time, we've got to bear in mind the fact that they're also producing copper, nickel, and cobalt, all of which is mined, in a world that's moving to electric vehicles and energy storage through batteries. So those commodities will be critical to the success of these new renewable energy forms. Now, the process of crushing rock that mining companies go through to extract the metal ore consumes about 3% of the world's energy use, which is huge, frankly. But Weir's produced and recently launched a product that cuts electricity consumption by 25%. And it also eliminates, importantly, the need for water, which is often a very scarce resource in these mining areas. Now, mining companies have made material commitments to reduce their carbon footprints, and the likes of Weir, we think, are superbly positioned to help them achieve their aims. So from our perspective at Magedi, we see the climate change debate as one that we feel we can influence our investee companies and encourage them to adopt energy saving strategies. In addition, we also see opportunities to invest in the picks and shovels that will provide, we think, the new growth areas for the world to come over the next 50 years in terms of the zero carbon aim of in 2050 that we're all rooting for. So I was going to pause there, Chairman, and perhaps we could open up for questions.
Yes, are there any questions, please, members? No.
So I'm just saying, I know I've had lots of questions around this. It's been lovely to have lots of them answered. Thank you very much.
Okay. Do you want to ask another one? Are you all right? Yes.
No,
okay.
that was it.
Okay, very good. Well, in that case, no questions. Thank you very much indeed for your presentation. I think that was really very informative indeed. We'll move on now to item 9, corporate governance monitoring, and I'd like to call upon Justin Bridges, please, to present this item.
Thank you, Chair. Justin Bridges, Head of Treasury and Pensions. This is the normal quarterly routine report that members receive each quarter, and it's just to note, it provides details of all the voting carried out by the managers over the last quarter to the 30th of September 2020. It provides an update on BMO's engagement. Obviously, we've heard from BMO today, and it also provides an update on LGPS Central and Legal and General's responsible investment. Again, we've heard about that today. So it's just a report to note, Chair, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Justin, very much for that. Are there any questions, please, members?
Sorry, Laura Hoskinson, I do have one small question. On page 10 of, it's page 85 of our report anyway. It's just a technical question. At the bottom, it's talking about top, second, third and bottom quartiles. Does that, and so Barclays has been engaged on climate change and it's got a big black dot in it. Is it bottom quartile? Is that bad or is that good?
I can come back to you on that, Laura. I can come back to you with further details if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. I just can't read the data very well. Thank you. Speak to you later.
No problem.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Justin. There's a recommendation. The recommendation is to accept the position as set out in the report, manager voting reports at Appendix A, and BMO Global Asset Management Responsible Engagement Overlay Activity Report at Appendix B. I'll propose, please can I have a seconder?
I'll second that for you, Chairman, Councillor Michael Wood.
Thank you very much. I will now accept the recommendation as set out in the report unless anyone else indicates differently. Okay, well, we accept the recommendation. Moving on then, please, to item 10, pensions administration monitoring. Can I ask Debbie Sharp, please, to introduce herself and present this item?
Thank you, Chair. Debbie Sharp, Pensions Administration Manager. The admin paper is one of the regular papers that updates on everything going on to administer the Shropshire County Pension Fund. I'm happy to take questions, but just wanted to point out a couple of the areas. 6.2, we'd had the employers meeting via Teams on the 21st of October. That was well attended by fund employers. And went down well with the topics that were covered for them, particularly around exit payment cap, exit payment reforms and what's going to come their way of the McLeod issues. 6.4 also there, just to point out to the Pensions Committee, we had mentioned when we were looking to engage on this topic, but the tax seminar for members of, not councillor members, but members of the pension fund was run and attended well across our scheme membership. That was run by Mercer's for us because they actually employ a registered financial advisor. That's going to be run next year as well. Went down well, and I think the education that was given to members is going to be very useful for them. 6.7, just to reiterate that we're not running an annual meeting this year because of the COVID restrictions. It would have to be a Teams meeting, and we've got everything available on the website, including the annual report now. The meetings that have been held recently for Pensions Committee, Pensions Board, the employers meeting have all been recorded and are available there for members to access. So there is plenty of information to update the membership on what is going on. We will reassess this next year depending on what happens. Point 10, just an update on the Government Actuary Department data collection for them to allow them to carry out the cost cap assessment across the whole of the local government pension scheme across the whole of the country. The data has been sent to them well within the timescales that they wanted. Point 11, the consultation on the McLeod extension to the statutory underpin to the membership. We have done a comprehensive response from the fund, and that was attached at Appendix B for you. 13, the exit payment cap. Again, there's the exit payment cap has come in. This has been talked about for about 5 years now by the government. So in public sector, employers who are covered by this legislation cannot make an exit payment of more than £95,000. That does impact on certain members of the local government pension scheme because the strain payment, the early payment of the benefits for anybody over 55 is included in that value. So employers who are affected have to contact us now and ensure that they're looking at valuing the exit payments correctly. But at present time, the local government pension scheme regulations haven't been changed in line with the exit payment cap. So unfortunately, we're in a position where we can't truly pay what the regulations state, and we'll have to wait further for either the members to appeal on this until legislation is changed. I'd just like to tell the committee at the moment, in Shropshire, across all of our members, we haven't got anybody who has been affected by this yet. So we know what we would do if we came across anybody, but at the moment we actually haven't got anybody who's affected. 13.6 just tells you that what we're following is the Scheme Advisory Board's view as to not to pay a fully unreduced pension to anybody, to actually only offer a reduced pension or a deferred pension. So we're not going against advice that's coming from the centre on this aspect. The reform in exit payments in local government that would ensure that our regulations came in line with the exit payment cap is being consulted on at the moment. We have done a consultation response that's attached at Appendix D. And then the point 17 was just to confirm for you and update the pension regulator scheme return, which statutorily we have to complete as a fund, and they do put out fines if people don't actually complete. That has been done. The deadline was the 15th of December, but that's now been made, and I'm happy to take any questions, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Debbie. Are there any questions, please?
Yes, Brian Williams here, member of the committee, if I could ask a question. First of all, can I say thank you to those who have emailed me to tell me how I can get all your delightful faces on the screen in front of me. It was very simple, and I'm now quite satisfied with the presentation of the representatives and members that I can see. Right, question for Debbie, if I may. I'm not sure whether this had curiosity or not. If I can take you all to page 99, which is page 9 of Debbie's report. This is if you look at the bottom, there's a table of mortality checking. Now, if you turn over leaf to para 19.5 on page 10 of Debbie's report, you'll see the total number of notifications of deaths of pension members which have been provided to the LGA are. Debbie, why is that line? Why are the numbers on that line? Why are the notifications of deaths in some cases higher than the actual deaths recorded? Or that would be the apparent conclusion for if you compare the figures on the line for 2020 on page 99 with the numbers notified over leaf.
Yeah, no, good question. It's because LGA have actually asked for them to be dealt with in the month that we were notified them of, whereas the previous table actually slots them into the actual month that they died. So there's a bit of an adjustment there that we get told of late deaths, and we have to adjust them into the correct month. So they're not reporting on exactly the same. They're reporting on deaths, but slightly differently. So the numbers allocated to the months, the first table, the mortality checking one at 19.1 there, is more relevant to actually see the trend of the deaths in the actual months. The other table is what we have to report to LG. So we thought it best to put it in there because that is being reported nationally, but that's literally the number of notifications we get, not that the death was in that month.
Yes, I understand that, but it's in some way the comparison of the figures. Let us take October, the month that has just passed. Over leaf, we apparently notified 52 deaths, whereas there were only actually 31 took place. I could understand if there was a 10% difference in the figures, but the figures are so vastly different. I find it quite remarkable.
They are in that month, Brian, and your question is exactly the same. I've raised it with my team, so you're not looking at the figures strangely there because that big jump in that month. I've asked them to check their reports, so if it is different, I'll report back. But no, you've picked up exactly what I did. But at the moment, I have been told the reports are correct, but they're actually investigating why that is the big difference in that month. So thank you for that.
Okay, thanks for that. It just seemed a somewhat interesting anomaly.
It did, and no, you picked up, and thank you for reading the reports very well. That is appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Bye.
Thank you. Any other questions? No, in that case, we'll move to the recommendation, which is to accept the position as set out in the report. I'll propose it, and may I have a seconder, please? Brian, are you seconding? Yep.
I'll second it, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'll now accept the recommendation as set out in the report, unless anyone else indicates differently. Well, no one has, so that's fine. Okay, well, that brings us to the conclusion of the public session. We now move to item 11, the exclusion of press and public. I move that under paragraph 10.2 of the Council's Access to Information Procedure Rules, that the proceedings of the committee in relation to agenda items 12 to 16 shall not be conducted in public on the grounds they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined by the categories specified against them. Can I have a seconder, please?
Yes, Chairman. Chris Mellon's happy to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now move into the private.
Chairman, Brian here, could I request a comfort break? Perhaps?
Yes, we are coming to that. I'll just get this next sentence out of the way, and then we will now move into the private.
I'll keep my legs crossed.
Unless anyone else indicates differently. So we have now moved into the private part of the agenda. And yes, I do suggest we have a comfort break for 5